two neighboring countries are exchanging heavy cross-border artillery strikes as we speak. Entire villages are being reduced to rubble. 133 Afghan Taliban fighters lie dead. 130 Pakistani soldiers have been killed, and 40 heavily fortified military posts have been completely overrun and seized. If you look at the raw satellite imagery and the casualty reports, it looks like an open, bloody war between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But if you step back from the kinetic violence, if you track the covert intelligence patterns, the historical incentive structures, and the quiet flow of international capital, a third, entirely silent global power comes into focus, pulling the geopolitical strings without firing a single shot.
What you are looking at is the violent, real-time collapse of a security doctrine that took 30 years and billions of dollars to build. We are watching a textbook example of a proxy conflict that has mutated into a direct existential crisis for the state that engineered it.
Welcome to this deep dive. The stakes here cannot be overstated. We are not just looking at a localized border dispute playing out on the evening news. This is the unraveling of a foundational geopolitical strategy that directly dictates global security, the international proliferation of terrorism, and the entire balance of power in Asia.
Right, the implications here are massive.
Exactly. We're pulling from a huge stack of declassified intelligence, historical data, and macroeconomic analyses today to answer one central mystery. Why is a nuclear-armed military currently fighting a desperate war against the very insurgent army it spent decades building? Have you ever wondered how years of secret operations and proxy wars eventually blow up in a nation's face?
It is a phenomenal question.
Today, we are unpacking the hidden architecture of the Afghan-Pakistan conflict and the incredibly complex allegations of India's silent structural maneuvering in the region. So, let's unpack this. We have to start with the visible violence right now. Pakistani Defense Minister Khawaja Asif essentially went on record and declared open war.
Yes, he did.
Pakistan's military has launched Operation Azam-e-Isteqam. It is a massive, kinetic, anti-militant operation resulting in devastating casualties on both sides. But to understand the mechanics of why these specific military posts are burning today, we actually have to look at a map from over a century ago.
That is exactly where the autopsy of this conflict has to begin. You just cannot understand the artillery fire of today without understanding the ink that was spilled in 1893. The absolute root cause of this structural failure is the Durand Line.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, it is a 2,600-kilometer border drawn by a British diplomat, Sir Mortimer Durand, and the Afghan ruler at the time, Amir Abdurrahman. But we have to look at the mechanics of why the British drew it. This was the peep of the Great Game.
Right, the imperial rivalry.
Exactly. The Russian Empire was expanding rapidly through Central Asia. They were swallowing up what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. They were spreading south like a glacier, and the British Empire was terrified for its crown jewel, which is India.
Right, because Britain had already fought multiple brutal wars in Afghanistan by the 1890s, and they realized they could never fully conquer the terrain or the people.
Precisely. The Afghan topography is just a graveyard for conventional armies. So the British pivoted. Instead of trying to subjugate Afghanistan, they decided to engineer a massive buffer zone. The Durand Line was negotiated to put physical, mountainous distance between expanding Russian influence and British India.
Makes sense from a colonial perspective.
Sure, but here is the catastrophic foundational flaw of that treaty. It was drawn with absolute disregard for the ethnic, linguistic, and tribal realities on the ground. With a single stroke of a diplomatic pen, the Durand Line sliced the Pashtun tribe squarely in two.
And this is where the tectonic pressure starts building. I mean, it's one thing to draw a line on a piece of paper in London, but how does that actually function on the ground?
It doesn't function at all.
Right. I mean, how does a line drawn in 1893 dictate airstrikes in 2026? It feels like funding a ruthless startup to bankrupt your biggest competitor, only to watch that startup grow so large it executes a hostile takeover of your own company. You can ignore the structural risks for a while, but eventually the math catches up with you.
That's a brilliant way to frame it, because it highlights the inevitability of the blowback. What's fascinating here is the mechanism of tribal identity. Afghanistan has never accepted the Durand Line as a legitimate international border. Not under the monarchy, not under the communists, not under the American-backed republic, and absolutely not under the Taliban today.
Wow, never.
Never.
Oh.
To understand why, you really have to understand Pashtunwali is the unwritten, millennia-old ethical code of the Pashtun people.
Let's expand on that for the listener, because I think a lot of people assume a border is just a border, It's enforced by guards and passports. How does Pashtunwali override state sovereignty?
Because to a Pashtun tribesman, the state is an abstract, often hostile concept. The tribe is absolute reality. Two of the core tenets of Pashtunwali are Milmastia, which is the absolute obligation of hospitality and protection to anyone who asks for it, and Badal, which is the obligation of justice and revenge.
So it's a deeply ingrained social contract.
Exactly. If your cousin lives 3 miles away, but there happens to be a British drawn line of barbed wire between you, that wire means nothing. If someone seeks sanctuary across that line, you are honor-bound to provide it, regardless of what the government in Kabul or Islamabad says.
That line was always a colonial fiction.
Yes, and the resentment surrounding it didn't just linger, it exploded in 1947 when the British finally left and partitioned the subcontinent.
Right, the birth of Pakistan. Suddenly, all those Pashtuns living on the British side of the Durand Line were absorbed into a brand new country.
Yes, and absorbed without true autonomy. During the 1947 partition, the Pashtuns were only given 2 choices. They could join Hindu-majority India or join Muslim-majority Pakistan.
There was no third option.
None. There was no option on the ballot for an independent Pashtunistan, which is what many tribal leaders desperately wanted. Consequently, and this is a historical data point that often shocks Western analysts, when Pakistan applied for sovereign membership to the United Nations in September 1947, Afghanistan was the only country in the entire world to vote against them.
Wait, hold on. I want to make sure I'm grasping the magnitude of that. Afghanistan was the only country, even India, who had just gone through a horrific, bloody partition with Pakistan, didn't vote against their UN membership.
Even India abstained or accepted the reality of the partition at the UN level. But Afghanistan actively trying to strangle the Pakistani state in its crib. They stood before the international community and basically said, we do not recognize this country's borders, and we do not recognize its right to exist in its current form.
That is an unbelievable geopolitical insult. Before Pakistan even had a chance to set up a functioning parliament, their immediate neighbor to the west was actively trying to block their existence.
And that exact moment programmed the DNA of Pakistan's military establishment. It created an immediate existential trauma.
I can imagine.
From the moment it was born, Pakistan's core security doctrine has been driven by the absolute paranoia of a 2-front war. They had a massive, hostile India on their eastern flank and a completely antagonistic Afghanistan on their western flank.
An Afghanistan that actively claimed a massive chunk of Pakistani territory as its own.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategists in Islamabad realized very early on that if Pakistan was going to survive, they had to somehow control, subvert, or entirely neutralize the government in Kabul.
And the cultural dynamic makes that paranoia even worse. When I was going through the research, the cultural contrast was staggering. The Afghan people historically harbored this deep-seated, visceral resentment toward Pakistan, but they have an immense organic love for India.
It is very striking.
We're talking about local Afghan vendors using Indian currency notes as clear phone covers. They openly call Indians their brothers. They consume Bollywood movies constantly.
Yeah. It is a phenomenal example of organic soft power. India's influence in Afghanistan isn't just built on statecraft. It's built on decades of cultural exchange, massive infrastructure projects like India literally building the Afghan parliament building, and a shared, deep-seated wariness of Pakistani interference.
So they have a mutual distrust of Islamabad.
Right. The Afghan populace views Pakistan as a manipulative, extractive force that constantly meddles in their affairs. Conversely, they view India as a benign, wealthy partner. This cultural reality terrifies the Pakistani military intelligence, the ISI.
Because a pro-India Afghanistan means Pakistan is permanently squeezed in a geopolitical vice.
Exactly. And if you are finding this historical context crucial to understanding today's headlines, make sure to subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss our future geopolitical breakdowns.
Yes, definitely subscribe. The economic and psychological weight of that 2-front paranoia is the perfect bridge to our next phase. Because Pakistan realized they couldn't win Afghan hearts, so they decided they had to aggressively engineer Afghan politics.
That is the tragic pivot.
And the late 1970s handed them the perfect, chaotic opportunity to do exactly that.
This is where the tectonic plates fundamentally shift. Fast forward to 1979. The Soviet Union violently invades Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. This triggers absolute panic in Washington.
The Cold War is at its peak.
Yes. So the CIA launches Operation Cyclone, which quickly becomes one of the longest, most expensive covert operations in the history of American intelligence.
Yeah.
The objective is simple. Fund, arm, and train the Afghan Mujahideen to bleed the Soviet Red Army dry. make it their Vietnam.
But the CIA has a logistical problem. They need a staging ground. They cannot put American boots on the ground or directly hand weapons to Afghan warlords without triggering World War III with the Soviets.
They need plausible deniability.
They need a middleman.
Exactly. They need a proxy. Enter Pakistan. For the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI, the Soviet invasion, was a geopolitical lottery ticket.
Wow, a lottery ticket.
Truly. They could use an endless river of American money and Saudi-funded weapons to build an army of militants. They could fight the Soviets, keep their own state's hands officially clean, and, most importantly, build a cadre of loyal, ideologically driven proxy fighters.
Fighters that they could eventually use to install a puppet, pro-Pakistan government in Kabul.
Precisely.
Let's get into the mechanics of how they actually did that, because the intelligence reports break this down in fascinating detail. Pakistan essentially set up secret laboratories, massive militant training camps on their own soil. And they focused their funding and training to forge what analysts call the 5 weapons.
Yes, the ISI became the ultimate venture capitalists for insurgency. The CIA funneled billions of dollars into Swiss bank accounts, which the ISI then controlled.
And they got to pick the winners.
Exactly, and the ISI heavily skewed that funding toward the most radical religious factions. They believed religious zealots would be easier to control than secular Afghan nationalists. The 5 weapons they cultivated were, first, the Afghan Taliban, who emerged slightly later from the religious schools in Pakistan.
Okay, that's one.
Second, the Haqqani network, which became Pakistan's most lethal, sophisticated, and trusted militant partner. Third, Hezb-e-Islami, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
Right.
Fourth, Al-Qaeda, which was brought into the fold as wealthy foreign fighters, including Osama bin Laden, flocked to the region to fight the Holy War. And fifth, various other fractured mujahideen groups.
And these weren't just low-level foot soldiers hiding in caves. We are talking about the absolute top tier of global militant leadership being openly sheltered by the Pakistani state. Mullah Omar, the legendary co-founder of the Taliban, was protected in the Pakistani city of Quetta.
Yes, he was.
Osama bin Laden, the architect of al-Qaeda, was eventually found hiding in plain sight in a massive compound in Abbottabad, which is practically down the street from Pakistan's premier military academy.
This was the execution of a doctrine known as strategic depth. The Pakistani military believed that by controlling these extreme militias, they could guarantee that Afghanistan would serve as a permanent fallback territory, a strategic depth in the event of a massive land war with India.
So it all comes back to India.
Always. If the government in Kabul was entirely dependent on the ISI for its survival, then Afghanistan would never align with New Delhi, and that pesky 1893 Durand Line issue would be permanently suppressed.
And for a brief window in the late 1990s, when the Taliban violently seized control of Kabul, the generals in Islamabad thought they had won the great game. They thought they had perfectly engineered their environment.
They really did. But then the calendar flips to 2001. We all know the catalyst, September 11th.
Almost 3,000 Americans die in a matter of hours.
Yes. The United States demands justice, and the Taliban in Afghanistan refuses to hand over al-Qaeda.
Now, I want to skip past the conventional recounting of 9/11 and get straight to the backroom diplomacy, because this is where Pakistan's master plan hits a brick wall. President George W. Bush issues a stark, binary ultimatum.
It was a brutal diplomatic awakening for Pakistan's president at the time, Pervez Musharraf. The Bush administration delivered an ultimatum through Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage that stripped away all the polite fictions of international diplomacy.
What did they say?
The message to Pakistan was, you are either 100% with us or you are with the terrorists. Armitage famously warned the Pakistani intelligence chief that if they chose the terrorists, Pakistan should be prepared to be bombed back to the Stone Age.
There is absolutely no gray area there. You can't play both sides when the reigning superpower is threatening to eradicate your infrastructure.
None whatsoever. The pressure from the U.S., NATO, and later figures like Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who famously warned Pakistan that you can't keep snakes in your backyard and expect them only to bite your neighbors, was insurmountable.
They had to pivot.
Pakistan was violently forced to join the global war on terror. The state had to officially turn its own military against the very militant proxies they had spent 2 decades and billions of dollars training, arming, and hailing as Islamic heroes.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I'm looking at the intelligence structures of the ISI. These are highly educated, deeply calculating strategists. How on earth did they not see this blowback coming?
That's a great question.
Did they really think they could mass produce heavily armed, ideologically radicalized militias, and then just, flip a switch and tell them, hey guys, the geopolitical winds have shifted. We're working for the Americans now. Please lay down your weapons and go home.
It is the ultimate tragic hubris of covert warfare. They honestly believed they could control the uncontrollable. They thought their leverage, which was money, weapons, and sanctuary, was stronger than the militants' religious and tribal ideologies.
That is a massive miscalculation.
It was fatal. Former ISI chief Assad Durrani was actually pressed on this exact strategic catastrophic failure in an interview. When asked about the horrifying blowback, the mass killing of Pakistani soldiers, the suicide bombings of Pakistani schools and markets, Durrani coldly referred to it as a Frankenstein's monster that they had created.
Wow.
He practically brushed off the deaths of his own citizens as mere collateral damage of necessary pragmatic state policies.
Collateral damage. That is a chilling clinical phrase when you look at the visceral reality of what happened next. Because the militants didn't just lay down their arms, they turned their guns around.
Violently and with terrifying organization. A militant leader named Batullah Masood recognized the betrayal and founded the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, often called the Pakistani Taliban.
And their goals were entirely different.
Right. Now, this is crucial. Their goal wasn't just to cross the border and fight the Americans in Afghanistan. Their stated objective was to wage a holy war against the Pakistani state itself. They wanted to overthrow the government in Islamabad, establish a strict Islamic caliphate inside Pakistan, and effectively annex the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or KP region.
The rifles and explosives that Pakistan bought to control Kabul were now detonating in the streets of your own capital. And the escalation we're seeing in the declassified timelines right now is absolutely staggering. The intelligence reports detail a specific, highly orchestrated event that really highlights the scale of this internal security collapse, the January 31, 2026 attack. The TTP didn't just execute this alone. They managed to form an alliance with the Baloch Liberation Army, the BLA.
This raises an important question about the sheer desperation of Pakistan's enemies, because the TTP and the BLA are ideological opposites.
Complete opposite.
The TTP is a radical Sunni religious insurgency operating in the mountainous northwest. The BLA is a largely secular ethno-nationalist insurgency operating in the massive, resource-rich, but economically starved southwestern province of Balochistan. They should, on paper, hate each other.
But they found a common cause.
Yes, in their absolute hatred for the Pakistani military.
They pooled their resources to launch what the BLA called Operation Hero. And the tactical sophistication of this operation is terrifying. Let's walk through the numbers. They launched highly coordinated simultaneous attacks across 48 different areas. The assault lasted 6 straight hours. They killed 102 Pakistani soldiers in a single day.
102 regular army soldiers killed by insurgents in a single coordinated wave. That is not a terrorist attack. That is a conventional military offensive.
It's open warfare.
And the trend lines are moving rapidly in the wrong direction for Islamabad. BLA attacks alone have quadrupled since 2020. They were reaching between 150 to 200 sophisticated attacks annually. And the supreme tragic irony of all of this, if you look at a heat map of violence in Pakistan today, 85% of all kinetic violence occurs in the KP and Balochistan regions.
Which are the exact geographical areas Pakistan historically used to build their secret labs and stage their proxy wars against Afghanistan.
Exactly. The staging ground became the primary battlefield. It is the mathematical certainty of proxy blowback. When a state bypasses its own legal infrastructure to empower non-state actors with heavy weaponry and radical ideology, it inherently destroys its own monopoly on violence.
They played with fire and burned the house down.
Pakistan is now fighting a desperate, multi-front war inside its own sovereign borders against the very entities it engineered for external projection.
So we have a complete internal collapse of Pakistan's grand security doctrine. Their western borders are on fire, their soldiers are dying by the hundreds, and their former proxies are actively trying to carve the country into pieces. The economic weight of fighting that internal war is crushing them, which naturally brings us to the geopolitical vacuum this creates. Between 2021 and 2022, the landscape in South Asia completely flips.
The pivot during those 24 months is one of the most remarkable, rapid geopolitical realignments of the 21st century. Let's set the stage. In August 2021, the United States chaotically withdraws from Afghanistan, and the Taliban sweeps back into Kabul with stunning speed.
We all remember those images.
Initially, the intelligence community viewed this as a massive historic strategic victory for Pakistan's ISI. and a devastating generational blow to India.
Because, as the historical data shows, from 1950 all the way to 2021, India had enjoyed generally friendly pro-India governments in Kabul, and suddenly the fundamentalist group that Pakistan literally birthed to counter Indian influence is back in the presidential palace.
Right.
Initially, the Taliban made aggressive anti-India statements regarding the disputed territory of Kashmir. India evacuated its embassies and refused to recognize the new Taliban government. It looked like New Delhi was entirely permanently locked out of Central Asia.
That was absolutely the conventional wisdom in the intelligence community in late 2021. But then the harsh, unforgiving reality of governance hit the Taliban, and the reality of macroeconomics hit Pakistan. This brings us to the 2022 shift.
What happened?
By early 2022, Afghanistan was facing total catastrophic economic collapse. The United States froze the Afghan central bank's foreign reserves. Western humanitarian aid, which had propped up the economy for 20 years, vanished overnight. 8.7 million Afghans were facing acute, imminent starvation.
It was a humanitarian disaster.
It was. And the Taliban suddenly realized that you cannot feed a country with captured Humvees and AK-47s. They desperately needed food, medicine, and hard currency to legitimize their rule and prevent mass civilian uprisings.
So naturally, in a crisis like that, a proxy looks to its patron. The Taliban looks to Islamabad for a bailout, but Pakistan is going through an economic meltdown of its own.
Precisely. Pakistan was experiencing a near-sovereign default. Inflation was skyrocketing between 20 to 30%. They were suffering from severe rolling blackouts, energy crises, and massive wheat shortages.
They couldn't even help themselves.
The political leadership in Islamabad was completely paralyzed. They were preoccupied with securing desperate, multi-billion-dollar bailouts from the International Monetary Fund just to keep their own lights on. Pakistan simply did not have the capital, the surplus grain, or the administrative bandwidth to bail out 40 million starving Afghans.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
Into this desperate, starving void steps India. But this is the genius of it. They didn't send weapons. They didn't send military advisors to fund a resistance. They sent wheat.
This is the absolute essence of pragmatic modern geopolitics. Indian strategists recognized the severe vulnerability of the Taliban and the complete incapacity of Pakistan. They stepped in massively and publicly.
What did they send exactly?
India negotiated complex logistics to deliver 500,000 doses of COVID-19 vaccines, 50,000 metric tons of wheat, and 6 million doses of the polio vaccine directly to the Afghan people. Furthermore, in their 2022 national budget, the Indian government officially allocated $27 million specifically for Afghan aid and development.
I want to pause on the logistics of that for a second, because how do you deliver 50,000 tons of wheat to a landlocked country controlled by an unrecognized militant regime, especially when the most direct route is straight through Pakistan?
That is the brilliance of the maneuver. India actually forced Pakistan into a diplomatic corner. They publicly demanded transit rights for humanitarian trucks so that Pakistan couldn't be seen as blocking food to starving Muslims.
Wow.
It was a masterclass in soft power leverage. That staggering amount of aid was deployed directly into what Pakistan considers its exclusive God-given sphere of influence.
But it wasn't just humanitarian charity. There was a massive, highly classified diplomatic pivot happening in the shadows. Indian intelligence opened secret back-channel relations with the very people who used to be their absolute worst nightmares.
Yes, they did.
The sources specifically point to Sirajuddin Haqqani. He's the leader of the notorious Haqqani faction, who, remember, was formerly Pakistan's most lethal asset and historically responsible for bombing Indian embassies. They also opened channels with Abbas Stanaksai, the Taliban's deputy foreign minister.
This is where we see the incentive architecture perfectly illustrated. Why on earth would the Haqqani network, which historically was essentially an extension of Pakistan's ISI, willingly engage with Indian diplomats?
Right, seems unthinkable.
Because of two structural realities. First, tribal identity. The Pashtun code of Pashtunwali ultimately matters far more to them than loyalty to a bankrupt, failing state in Islamabad. Second, the Taliban leadership realized that total reliance on a single, economically fragile patron was strategic suicide.
If Pakistan falls, they fall.
They needed to frantically diversify their portfolio of international relations. The immediate result of India's outreach, the Haqqani faction, to the utter shock and panic of Islamabad, stopped overtly supporting Pakistan's strategic goals.
Now, this is a highly sensitive pivot point in the geopolitical narrative, and it is crucial to note here, directly to you listening, that we are entirely impartial in this deep dive. We are simply reporting the claims made by the CIA, Pakistani officials, and the provided source material.
Absolutely.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, we are not verifying them as absolute truth, and we are certainly not taking any political side. We are strictly laying out the intelligence puzzle exactly as it exists in the sources we are analyzing.
And the claims within that intelligence puzzle are severe. The sources indicate that top Pakistani officials, and according to some reports, elements of the American CIA, allege that India is now using the Taliban as a proxy in reverse.
A reverse proxy war.
The allegation from Islamabad is that Indian intelligence is actively funding the TTP to destabilize Pakistan from within and utilizing the Taliban's vast network to track down and assassinate Kashmiri militants who have been hiding in Pakistani territory for years.
The intelligence files specifically mention a viral video from 2017 featuring a former TTP commander named Sanullah Ehsan. In the video, he openly claims that the TTP receives direct funding and logistical support from Indian intelligence. There is also a fascinating note from a prominent Indian strategist, Harat Kanad, who highlighted that Pakistan was so panicked by this dynamic that they actually begged U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis to intervene and stop India's alleged covert support of these anti-Pakistan groups.
It really raises a profound question about the nature of covert warfare and state paranoia. Whether these specific allegations are entirely factual, partially true but exaggerated, or purely Pakistani deflection to excuse their own internal failures, they highlight a reality that has completely inverted the region's dynamic.
Right, the dynamic is totally flipped.
India has not officially recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. Yet, pragmatically, they have allowed Afghan diplomats to operate consulates in Mumbai and Hyderabad. This is the very definition of pragmatic engagement.
In high-level geopolitics, ideological purity is a luxury that no one can afford.
Leverage is a necessity. India realized they could bypass the Pakistani state entirely, step over the historical bad blood, and engage directly with the Afghan factions based on mutual economic need.
So if you value this kind of long-form, unbiased breakdown of complex global power dynamics, please hit the like button. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives. So what does this all mean for the listener? We've mapped out the 130-year history, the CIA funding, the proxy blowback, and India's quiet, devastating pivot.
It's a lot of process.
If you are a global investor, a security analyst, or just a citizen trying to understand where the world is heading, we have to look at the future trajectory. We are looking at Pakistan today, a nuclear-armed nation with a heavily indebted economy, actively fighting a bloody border war with Afghanistan, while dealing with massive, coordinated internal insurgencies from the TTP and the BLA. Where does this map go in the next 10 to 20 years?
We have to analyze the future through a spectrum of probabilities, because the variables are incredibly volatile. Let's start with the best-case scenario.
Okay, give us some hope.
In a highly optimistic world, the sheer, crushing reality of mutual economic necessity forces a diplomatic de-escalation. Pakistan is forced by the IMF to implement incredibly harsh, unpopular structural reforms, which eventually secures long-term bailouts and slowly stabilizes its macroeconomy.
And on the Afghan side?
Simultaneously, the Taliban in Afghanistan realizes that harboring the TTP is too costly, so they quietly rein them in. Kabul focuses entirely on internal rebuilding by balancing massive infrastructure investments from India, China, and Iran. The physical border cools down simply because neither side has the financial capital to sustain an active war.
But as we've seen, geopolitics in South Asia rarely adheres to the best-case scenario, especially when the entire foundation is built on a 130-year-old fault line. What does the worst-case scenario look like?
The worst-case scenario is a total, catastrophic collapse of the Pakistani state's monopoly on power, leading to a violently fragmented nation. And to understand this, you have to factor in the massive demographic time bomb ticking right now. Pakistan is currently hosting upwards of 5 million Afghan refugees.
5 million people. That is an unbelievable number of displaced human beings living within the borders of an already economically fragile state.
This is a staggering burden.
And the sources note a really dark dynamic here. The Afghan government openly believes Pakistan uses these 5 million refugees as geopolitical hostages to extract millions in UN aid money. Meanwhile, Pakistan claims they are generously providing safe haven at a massive cost to their own society.
Both narratives exist simultaneously.
But regardless of who is right, it's a massive, marginalized, heavily monitored population living inside a failing economy.
Exactly. And that is the tinderbox. If the cross-border artillery war intensifies and Pakistan continues its policy of mass deportations and police crackdowns on these refugee camps, those 5 million displaced people could become highly radicalized against Islamabad.
They have nothing left to lose.
Right. If that massive demographic aligns its grievances with the heavily armed TTP in the north and the Bloc Liberation Army in the south, you create an unstoppable, multi-front internal insurgency. The Pakistani military, as large as it is, becomes overstretched. The state begins to splinter violently along ethnic and tribal lines.
That is terrifying.
You have to keep in mind, this isn't purely theoretical. There are already ongoing massive civil protests in regions like Sindh and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. A nuclear-armed nation of over 230 million people fracturing under the weight of multiple unified insurgencies is a global security nightmare that would make the Syrian civil war look small by comparison.
A nightmare that would inevitably drag in every major world power. I mean, the US, China, Russia, they would all be desperately trying to secure Pakistan's nuclear arsenal.
Without a doubt.
But let's ground this. We have the optimistic piece and the apocalyptic collapse. If we're looking at the hard trend lines and economic indicators today, what is the most realistic outcome?
The most realistic outcome is a prolonged, exhausting, low-intensity bleed. Pakistan will likely avoid total state collapse. The international community, particularly China, which has massive investments there, and the United States, are heavily incentivized to prevent a nuclear state from completely failing.
So they'll get bailed out.
The IMF will keep them on life support. However, Pakistan will remain economically dependent, politically paralyzed by military interference, and violently internally fractured. They will be forced to spend their meager national budget fighting a grueling, expensive, endless counterinsurgency against the TTP and BLA.
And Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, meanwhile, will maintain its fierce strategic autonomy. They will survive by playing regional powers like India, China, and Russia against each other to secure a steady drip of humanitarian and infrastructure aid.
And the India factor. How does New Delhi play this long game?
This is where India's structural, long-term advantage becomes virtually insurmountable. The deeper the enmity and violence between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the greater India's strategic leverage becomes. India doesn't need to fire a single official shot across the border.
They just keep sending aid.
They don't need to risk sending a single soldier into the Afghan mountains. They will likely just continue their masterclass in asymmetric soft power diplomacy, sending shipments of wheat, building parliament buildings, offering medical aid, and providing scholarships to Afghan students.
It's brilliant.
By simply being a wealthy, reliable, non-interfering economic partner to Afghanistan, India doubles down on its own massive economic strengths while continuously exploiting and quietly watching its rivals' vulnerabilities hollow out from the inside.
It is the ultimate expression of the long game. As the declassified sources remind us, there is no conclusive public smoking gun of direct Indian intelligence raw involvement in funding the current insurgency inside Pakistan. And as we know from history, highly classified covert intelligence takes 20 to 50 years to become public. Some files never see the light of day. But you don't always need to find a smoking gun when you can just read the macroeconomic shifts and watch the wheat trucks roll across the border.
Precisely. If you are a listener actively watching this region, you don't need classified clearance. You just need to monitor 3 highly visible signals.
What should they look for?
First, watch the macroeconomic indicators in Pakistan, specifically the inflation rates, foreign currency reserves, and their compliance with IMF loan conditions. If their economy continues to hollow out, their physical ability to project military force evaporates.
Makes sense. What's the second signal?
Second, watch the legal and social status of those 5 million Afghan refugees. Any sudden mass deportations or violent police crackdowns in the camps will immediately signal a massive escalation in cross-border hostilities.
And the third?
And third, watch the frequency, scale, and sophistication of joint military operations between the secular BLA and the religious TTP. If those two ideologically opposed groups fully integrate their command structures and logistics, Pakistan's internal bleed will rapidly become a fatal hemorrhage.
So we've traveled from a dusty map room in 1893, where a British diplomat carelessly drew a line through a mountain range to keep the Russians at bay, right into the secret CIA-funded intelligence labs that birthed the modern era of proxy warfare. You've seen how a military's arrogant attempt to control a neighbor birthed a Frankenstein monster that is now tearing at the very fabric of the state that engineered it.
It really is a profound cautionary tale.
And we've watched as a silent geopolitical masterclass in soft power has leveraged bags of wheat and shipping containers of vaccines to fundamentally, perhaps permanently, alter the balance of power in Asia.
It is a stark, unforgiving reminder that in the modern era, true geopolitical leverage is rarely created through direct military conquest. It is created by deeply understanding the structural vulnerabilities of your opponents, being patient, and simply allowing their own flawed hubristic architectures to collapse under the weight of historical inevitability.
And that leaves us with a lingering, profound thought. As we wait decades for the classified intelligence files to finally open in the vaults of Washington, Islamabad, and New Delhi, ask yourself this. When a nation's foundational strategy is built entirely on engineering violence and chaos in its neighbor's yard, is its eventual internal collapse an accident, or is it just mathematical certainty? And in the highly connected modern world of geopolitics, are the most devastating wars truly fought with artillery shells and bullets, or are they won with frozen bank accounts and bags of wheat?
That is the real question.
What stands out to you about this complex geopolitical triangle? Do you think proxy strategies can ever actually be fully controlled by the state, or is violent blowback always inevitable? Drop your thoughts, your theories, and your analysis in the comments. We genuinely read them and want to see how you synthesize this intelligence. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Share this with anyone fascinated by the raw, hidden reality of global affairs, and we will see you next time.